It was January's frigid grip, the heart of winter, when our story begins. Outside, the world was wrapped in a thick blanket of snow, utterly silent. Yet, my mind was far from still. My son Mark had just turned 19, a gifted artist immersed in his craft. His world revolved around sketches and paintings, each capturing human forms with stunning emotion and movement. His studio, a room in our home that he had claimed as his own, was his retreat. It was a creative mess, filled with canvases, jars of brushes, and splashes of paint that spoke to his passion. Mark's maturity often surprised me. He was far more grounded than his father, who was always preoccupied with work or hobbies that kept him away from home. That morning, I sat in the kitchen, wrapped in a thick robe, cradling a steaming mug of coffee against the winter chill that seeped through the walls. Mark had worked late into the night, and I hadn't wanted to disturb him. Lost in thought, staring at the frosted window, I heard the familiar creak of the stairs. "Morning, Mom," Mark greeted, his deep voice warm and calm. He carried a canvas under one arm and a cup of tea in the other. His hair was disheveled, his face still showing traces of sleep, but his eyes sparkled with inspiration. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, watching as he leaned the canvas carefully against the counter. I couldn't help but smile at his energy, so vibrant, even in the depths of winter. "Did you get any sleep last night?" I asked. He shrugged, a sheepish grin tugging at his lips. "Not really. I was working on something." "Want to see?" Curiosity piqued. I nodded. He turned the canvas around, revealing a painting so vivid and raw that it left me breathless. It was a study of the human figure, the subject bathed in soft light. The posture was both vulnerable and strong, carrying a depth of emotion far beyond his years. "It's incredible, Mark," I said sincerely. "You have such a gift." His cheeks turned pink, and he looked away, clearly embarrassed by the praise. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't do it without your support." We shared a quiet moment, the kind of unspoken understanding that often passed between us. His father, though a good man, was rarely present in the way Mark was. It was a reality I had grown used to over the years, even as it left a subtle emptiness I seldom acknowledged. Later that day, as I walked past Mark's studio, I couldn't resist peeking inside. He stood in front of a canvas, his brush moving with fluid, confident strokes. His focus was intense, yet his movements carried an easy grace. When he noticed me, he paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "Caught me," he teased affectionately. "Want to see what I'm working on now?" Drawn by his invitation, I stepped inside. The smell of paint and turpentine filled the air, and the winter sunlight, streaming through the window, cast a golden glow over his workspace. He stepped aside, revealing his latest work, a detailed study of hands, their positions intricate and expressive. "They're beautiful," I murmured, marveling at his precision. He turned to me, his gaze steady. "I'm thinking of starting a series," he said, "exploring emotions through the human form." "That sounds amazing," I replied, genuinely impressed by his vision. You've always had a way of seeing things that others overlook. Mark's expression softened, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something unspoken pass between us. It wasn't the first time I had felt it. A quiet connection that went beyond the typical bond between mother and son. It reminded me how much we leaned on each other, especially in the absence of his father's presence. The winter days passed, filled with Mark's growing collection of artwork and our moments of shared warmth. Yet, as we grew closer, I began to question the boundaries in our relationships and the quiet spaces where admiration and love intertwined. Mark wasn't just my son, he was an extraordinary young man whose presence filled the empty corners of my world. That evening was calm and still, the kind of January night when snow muffles every sound. My husband, as usual, had gone out bowling with friends, leaving Mark and me alone in a house that felt somehow cozier without him. Mark had been especially attentive that day, offering little compliments that warmed me unexpectedly. "Mom, you've got this way about you," he said earlier as I stood in the kitchen making dinner. I turned to him with a curious smile. "What way?" Leaning casually against the doorway, he grinned. "The way you make a place feel like home. It's rare, you know." I laughed softly, brushing off his words as simple flattery. But they stayed with me. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, with a quiet sincerity that made me feel truly seen. Later that night, as I sat by the fire flipping through a magazine, Mark emerged from his studio carrying a box. His dark eyes sparkled with excitement, and his smile was almost boyish. "Mom, I have an idea," he said, setting the box on the coffee table in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, intrigued. "Open it," he urged, stepping back with his hands tucked into his pockets. I lifted the lid to uncover a striking red satin robe, the fabric shimmering like liquid fire in the soft light. My breath caught in my throat. "Mark, what's this for?" I asked. He shrugged, though his expression was serious. "I've been thinking about starting a new portrait series, something personal, but warm and full of emotion. I want to capture elegance and intimacy. Would you let me paint you?" I stared at the robe, my heart pounding at the thought of being his subject. The idea thrilled me and unsettled me in equal measure. "You want me to wear this?" I asked hesitantly. He nodded. "I think it would look amazing on you. It's just for the painting, of course." After a brief pause, I agreed. There was something irresistible about his request and the way his passion for art lit up his face. "All right," I said softly. "Let's do it." He smiled, his excitement contagious. "Great. Go put it on, and I'll get everything ready." I carried the box upstairs, my hands trembling slightly as I slipped into the robe. The cool satin brushed against my skin, clinging gently to my figure. It was undeniably beautiful, and as I caught my reflection in the mirror, I felt a surprising surge of confidence. When I returned downstairs, Mark had transformed the living room. A chair draped with a soft wool blanket had been placed in the center of the room. The fireplace cast a warm, flickering glow over the space. His easel stood nearby, holding a blank canvas ready for his vision. "You look stunning," he said, his voice low and filled with admiration. His gaze lingered for a moment before he seemed to catch himself, gesturing toward the chair. "Sit here and relax." I did as he instructed, settling into the chair and letting the blanket's softness soothe my nerves. Mark began to paint, his brush moving confidently as he alternated glances between me and the canvas. "Hold still," he teased at one point, his tone playful. "Not that it's hard for you. You've got this natural grace about you." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're too much, Mark." "No, really," he said earnestly, his gaze locking with mine. "You're beautiful, Mom. I hope this painting does you justice." His words stirred something deep inside me, a mix of pride and vulnerability that I wasn't prepared to confront. I stayed silent, letting the crackling fire and the rhythmic sound of his brush fill the quiet space between us. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere shifted. A new closeness began to form, an unspoken connection that felt deeper than words. Mark's compliments became more personal, his tone softer, and I found myself drawn to the warmth he radiated. "Do you remember?" he said suddenly, his brush pausing mid-stroke. "When I was little and used to draw pictures of you with crayons. You always kept them, no matter how bad they were." I smiled at the memory. They weren't bad. They were from you. That made them priceless. He chuckled, his expression softening. "You've always been my favorite subject, not just for art, but for everything." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my cheeks grow warm. There was a depth in his tone that made me feel more seen and appreciated than I had in years. When he finally finished, Mark stepped back to examine the painting, a hint of pride in his voice as he announced, "Done." I crossed the room to see his work. The portrait captured me bathed in the firelight, the satin robe draped elegantly over my shoulders. But it wasn't just the technical skill that moved me. It was how he had captured something deeper, something I hadn't realized I carried. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "Thank you for everything." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the painting or the way Mark had looked at me. Our relationship had always been close, but now it felt as if it were evolving into something more layered, richer. While the thought unsettled me, it was also undeniably comforting. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room as I stirred awake. Before my thoughts could settle, the aroma of fresh coffee reached me. I opened my eyes to see Mark standing by my bedside, a playful grin on his face. In one hand, he held a steaming mug, and in the other, a single daisy, simple and sweet. "Morning, Muse," he teased, his voice warm and affectionate. "I thought you deserved a little extra pampering today." A smile spread across my face, still half asleep, but completely charmed by his thoughtfulness. "You're spoiling me," I murmured as I sat up, taking the coffee he placed on the nightstand. "That's the idea," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding out the daisy. His expression softened as he studied me, his gaze lingering in a way that made my heart flutter. "You've always been my inspiration, Mom," he said. "I don't think I've ever felt this connected to my work or to someone." His honesty left me breathless, piercing through the composure I usually maintained. Before I could respond, he lifted my hand and kissed it gently. "There's more to come," he said, his tone shifting to playful. "Tonight, I've got a surprise for you, but you'll have to keep the studio door closed. If Dad sees it, well, let's just say he wouldn't understand." My pulse quickened at his words, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness swirling in my chest. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Mark chuckled as he stood. "You'll see. I need to grab a few things, but trust me, you'll love it." With that, he left the room, leaving me alone with the coffee, the flower, and a whirlwind of emotions I wasn't ready to process. Throughout the day, I found myself replaying his words, his gestures, and the way he looked at me. I felt a strange giddiness, like a teenager with a crush, yet also deeply conflicted. Mark wasn't just anyone, he was my son. Yet, the way he treated me, the way he saw me, made me feel like a woman again, not just a mother or a wife. As the evening wore on, my anticipation only grew. I distracted myself by preparing dinner, pouring 2 glasses of wine, and doing my best not to overthink what the night might hold. By the time I made my way to Mark's studio, my heart was pounding. The door creaked open to reveal him standing amid the familiar chaos of canvases and paint. He looked different, more self-assured, more composed. In his hands was a small red box, its bold color catching the light. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and inviting. "Come in." I stepped inside and closed the door, following his gesture to sit in the chair he had positioned at the center of the room. The atmosphere was charged with intimacy, the faint scent of paint lingering in the air, accompanied by soft music playing in the background. My curiosity piqued as he handed me the box. "Open it," he urged, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid to reveal a sleek leather outfit, a pair of cat ears, black lingerie, and even a small tail. My cheeks flushed, and I looked up at him, unsure of what to say. "You're my muse," he said sincerely. "I want to capture you in a way that's bold, fearless, and unapologetically you." The weight of the moment pressed down on me, making me hesitate. But the way he looked at me, brimming with confidence and admiration, made it impossible to refuse. Nodding slowly, I took the box and stepped behind the screen he had set up in the corner. As I changed, the leather clung to my skin, leaving me feeling both empowered and exposed. When I finally stepped out, Mark's reaction was instant. His eyes widened slightly before a slow smile spread across his face. "You're perfect," he said softly, motioning for me to sit again. "Absolutely perfect." He adjusted the lighting, music, and his easel with practiced precision before beginning to sketch. His movements were deliberate and steady, the room quiet except for the scratch of charcoal against paper and his occasional murmurs of approval. I watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands moving confidently. There was something deeply intimate about the way he studied me, his eyes tracing every curve and shadow, as though I were the most captivating subject he had ever seen. As time passed, the lines between us seemed to blur. Mark's compliments became bolder, his teasing more tender, and I found myself unable to resist the warmth that radiated from him. Though I knew we were venturing into uncertain territory, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Nor could I ignore the feelings growing within me. When he finally finished, the connection between us felt undeniable. Setting down his tools, he stepped closer, his gaze locked on mine. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for trusting me, for letting me see you." A wave of emotion swelled in my chest, leaving me speechless. Instead of responding, I reached out, took his hand, and held it tightly. The moment felt fragile, yet profound, like we were stepping into something neither of us fully understood but couldn't deny. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed every look, every word, and every touch in my mind. I knew our relationship had shifted, deepened in ways that defied explanation. Though I didn't know where it might lead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something extraordinary and uncharted. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of my phone on the nightstand. Reaching for it, I saw a message from him. "Come to me. I can't sleep." My breath hitched as I read the words, simple but laden with meaning. My heart raced as I debated what to do. But before I could stop myself, I was slipping out of bed and padding quietly down the hall to his studio. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. When I opened the door, Mark was seated on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. He looked up as I entered, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and vulnerability. "Mom," he began, his voice barely audible, "I need to know. Do you feel it too, the way I do?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I knew exactly what he was asking, and though I had tried to deny it to myself, I couldn't lie to him, not when his eyes held mine with such raw honesty. "Yes," I admitted softly, my voice trembling. "I do. Relief washed over his face, and he stood, closing the distance between us in a few quick steps. "You've always been more than just my mom," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion as his hands rested gently on my shoulders. "You've been everything to me." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me into an embrace that made the rest of the world seem to melt away, leaving only the two of us. After a long moment, he pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on my shoulders. "I have an idea," he said, his tone lighter and more playful now. "While Dad's asleep, let's do something, just for us." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Paint therapy," he replied, a mischievous sparkle in his eye. "It's a way to express emotion through touch and color. I've been wanting to try it for a long time, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather share it with than you." His suggestion caught me off guard, but the sincerity in his voice made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said softly, unsure of what to expect, but trusting him completely. "All right," I said, a nervous smile tugging at my lips. "Show me." Mark's face brightened, and he quickly set to work gathering supplies. Bottles of vibrant paint, a large roll of canvas, and towels to protect the floor. As he arranged everything, his enthusiasm was contagious. "You just let go," he explained, placing the canvas in the center of the room. "No rules, no overthinking, just pure emotion." He poured the paint directly onto the canvas, the red, blue, and gold hues swirling together in mesmerizing patterns. Then, turning to me, he extended his hand. "Shall we?" I hesitated briefly before placing my hand in his. He guided me to the canvas, and together we dipped our fingers into the paint, smearing it across the surface. At first, it was light-hearted, playful streaks of color, laughter, and the fun of painting each other's hands and arms. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted into something more profound. Mark's movements became slower, his touch deliberate as he traced intricate designs on my skin. "You're beautiful," he said softly, meeting my gaze. "Every part of you." Heat rose to my cheeks, and instead of pulling back, I allowed myself to lean into the moment. I reached out, drawing a shimmering golden line along his collarbone, watching the paint catch the light on his skin. The room was filled with the quiet rhythm of music, the flickering glow of candles, and the warmth of our shared closeness. With every gentle brush of his hand, every glance we exchanged, the lines between us seemed to dissolve. As the session came to an end, we lay side by side on the canvas, our bodies covered in colorful swirls. Mark turned to me, his expression soft and thoughtful. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me, for being here." I smiled, my heart swelling. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. That night, as I lay in bed, every detail replayed in my mind. Mark was no longer just my son. He was a man, strong, passionate, and brimming with vitality. And while the road we had taken together was anything but conventional, I couldn't deny the depth of the bond we now shared.